Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all again. And we're beginning again our Thursday morning classes. And we are, for now, pausing our study of Maimonides to study the book of Kohelet, of Ecclesiastes. Today, we're going to be doing a general introduction and talking about the first few lines of Kohelet. We're going to be doing a lot of jumping around on Sefaria, going to see different sources and talking about the big themes. And then beginning next week, we're really going to be going through and I think aiming for one chapter a week, one chapter a session. There are a few chapters that are longer and those will take longer, but we're going to be going in depth, and everybody, as always, feel free to bring in discussion, or if you have a story or a thought, where discussion is always encouraged. And Ecclesiastes is a very interesting book. It's a very accessible book of the Tanakh. It's very unusual. It doesn't give you what you would think a book of the Tanakh is going to give you. It's a little heretical in a certain kind of way, because we'll get into all of it. It's also a short book, and it's a very mysterious book. The scholars can't agree on anything about it. They can't agree on what the message really is. They can't agree on what who is really the author from the scholar's point of view of the book of Kohelet, of Ecclesiastes, and what period does it really come from, and how is it one author or multiple authors, and every period of scholarship of the modern era brings in new answers to all of those questions. For a while, people had these theories that Kohelet was coming from many different sources that were all brought together into this little collection. People don't think that anymore. There's been scholarship that have been always looking at where is Kohelet purely Jewish wisdom, or is it coming from other sources? And there was even one scholar who believed that somehow some Buddhist influence from the East made its way to Israel and made its way into this book. But it's a very profound book about life that asks the very big questions. What is life about? How should we live? And still as relevant today as it was back then, even more relevant, and we'll get to that. Anybody have any initial thoughts? What is it when you think of this book of Kohelet or Ecclesiastes? Are there any thoughts that come to you, or any verses or anything about this book, either that you remember from studying or just an impression you have in your mind?
Well, for me, it's always been something beautiful. Even as a kid, when I was taught it in Sunday school and confirmation class, there was just something very special about.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a very, very special book.
This is the book that's always skipped over because it is difficult and mysterious, and there is no one consensus on it. So in my years of study, it's always the one that gets skipped over for those reasons. So I'm real curious.
Could be skipped over because it's futile to study it.
It gets skipped over because it asks more questions than it resolves.
Beautiful. Well, it's really interesting. Here when you read Kohelet, and as the beginning of the book is all is futile or vanity of vanities, and you're reading through this book, this ancient book, and you get to the very last end of it, and it says, well, all books are also vanities and futile. I think, well, why did I just spend all this time reading this book? But it opens up something very specific, the book, and I think it comes through very straightforwardly in many ways, because the message keeps coming back. It's a book where you have certain words and certain expressions are found nowhere else in Tanakh. And, you can find them once in one other book or twice. And here they come up many times and over again. So it's It's almost like the message is almost like a mantra. It keeps coming back in different forms, same message. While other books say different messages throughout, this one, the same message keeps coming back to us. The word for futility comes back 38 times, vanity or futility. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Anybody else, what this book conjures for you, brings up in you?
I don't know the book, but I know from studying with you and other studies I've done that much of the way we are taught is by doubt and by challenge. And so if something doesn't answer us a question, it's leading us to a pathway.
Beautiful. It's true. The question can lead us to an experience and to a way of looking at the world, just the question itself. But of all the questions that are asked in the Talmud, very few are answered, for good and for bad. But this book, Kohelet asks a lot of questions. It does bring us some answers, but the answers really are supposed to come from within. It's supposed to lead us to a way of being and of thinking. And maybe a little link to Maimonides and to our previous study, right? Maimonides, you can't say God is something. You can only say God is not this. So if you start to say this is futile and this is futile and this is futile, and you go through all of life, eventually you get to what is not futile, right? Eventually get to what is meaningful. And there's almost like an experiential side to that. This is vanity and this is vanity. So eventually your mind is thinking, okay, well, tell me what is not vanity. And Kohelet does tell you, but it also leaves us open to make that decision and go down that pathway.
I think that it forces you to reflect on your life. And the big question is, what is life?
Beautiful.
If you're studying it over and over again, hopefully that you'll figure it out at the end.
Beautiful. Thank you. Right there. It's one of those books that really is about life in general, and life back then, life now. It's still the same big questions. And the traditional understanding of the book is, right, there are 3 books in our Tanakh that are attributed traditionally to King Solomon. There's Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, which according to tradition Solomon wrote when he was young. Right, so it's a love poem, a passionate poem. Then there's Mishle Proverbs, which is a book of proverbs, of wisdom about life, how to live in this world and family and job, all kinds of things. And that's attributed to Solomon in his middle age. And then Kohelet is his wisdom at the end of life, right? It's his he's an old king now, and what is all, he's explored all of life, right? There's nothing new under the sun. So what at the end of his life, what is his wisdom about what it's all about? And so it becomes that kind of meditation on life and also on mortality and on just living itself. What is the act of living about? Anybody else?
Yes, if I may. Just a couple of sort of signposts or cautionary notes. One is I saw in the selections in the from Kohelet in the Siddur, the Lev Shalem Siddur, that of course they had to leave things out, so they did, of course, but they didn't put it in the whole thing. But there's a note there that assures you that it's really a kosher book, which I found, because it says, after all, it has in the very last verse, I think it is, so fear God and obey his commandments and forget everything else I just told you. Or at least the first part of that is very explicit. And that's just so striking to me because there's such a sensitivity to different perspectives and so on. But here they feel the need, I guess, the editors, to, I'm talking about the Siddur, to reassure the congregation, because it really is, as you suggested, a book. It's a skeptical and you might say an agnostic book and a fatalistic book is a term that's used. And the other thing I wanted to say was that the language, I've been reading about it, the language is really different from the other books. It's more like the language of the Mishnah. I mean, I'm not talking here about the date it was written. That doesn't interest me nearly as much as the fact that it's from a different perspective. And the phrase, I was taught by a rabbi many years ago that is it Ein Chadash Tachat Hashemesh? There's nothing new under the sun, and maybe I have that wrong. That although it's nowhere else in the Tanakh, it's repeatedly in the wisdom literature of other Mediterranean peoples. So we see that it's part of a broader conversation in a way. I just wanted to throw that in.
Thank you. Well, there's a lot of discussion for the wisdom books in general of where if the Israelites took them from other traditions, in particular the Egyptians, we have lots of records of Egyptian wisdom tradition, and there are parts of the book of Proverbs that match, and they're almost identical to books, to Egyptian books, wisdom books, and the mode of it, in the words of a king giving his, so to speak, wisdom about life, it was a common format in the ancient Near East, and some of the wisdom of Ecclesiastes matches very well from other places. And so what the scholarship for a long time was that there were certain parts that were added to make it kosher, because there's a part in Kohelet which struck me a few days ago, where King Solomon, the builder of the temple, says, do not be overeager to go to the house of God. Do not be overeager to go to the temple, which that might be the most heretical verse in the whole of Kohelet. And so the traditional scholarship was that the scholarship, not the tradition, but the scholarship was at the end of it, the very last verse, suggested was it was added at a later time to make the book kosher, because the rabbis saw that it was a wonderfully powerful and profound book and wanted to include it in the canon, but they needed to clean it up a little bit, make it a little bit more kosher. So they added things here and there. Of course, we can't be sure. These are all theories, and what the scholars believe. Again, this is a very wide window of when they think it came, but they anywhere from 500 BC to even maybe the year 200 up to the Mishnah. So it's a period of 700 years or even 800 years that that scholars have been arguing and debating, from analyzing the language and the themes. But our tradition, and again, these are all theories, but our tradition ascribes it to King Solomon. One of the reasons is because, they're called books of wisdom in scholarship, and it's not that different in Hebrew. They're called books of chokhmah, of wisdom. And there's actually, I'll just pull this up, and then we're going to start to get into it. I'm going to Safari.
Let me interrupt for 1 second, because I
Go
have
ahead.
a wonderful book which has both the Hebrew and the English and a huge number of annotations that are in here from the Midrash, from all kinds of rabbis, etc., in the past, in the Talmud. And this is actually still obtainable. I got this in 1978 from a bookseller on Dearborn Street. But in any case, this book is still obtainable if anybody's interested in it. It's a very, very good from a strictly Hebrew perspective.
And I think that is a wonderful series, and it's a lot of the traditional commentators and midrash, and it's the traditions perspective, and yeah, very, I love that series as well. And it's amazing. It's still in print. So
David, could you put that in the comments, please? That book in the comments, the title and the publisher. I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
okay. So we're going to look at the beginning of Kohelet, and ask some of the big questions today. But I first wanted to take us just to why Solomon? Why is this in the words of Solomon? So I'm taking us to the book of Kings. The beginning of the book of Kings. Solomon has just become king, just before he builds the temple. King Solomon is King David's son. He's comes to power through a series of interventions from the prophet Nathan and his mother Bathsheba to rise to the throne despite the attempts by his older brothers to become king. And then when he becomes king, he's quite ruthless in putting down all of the claims of his brothers and of all of his enemies. But then he starts to nation build, and he starts to build the temple eventually. Here we have him turning to God. He has a conversation with God, which is a good sign. It shows that he has that ability, and he prays to God. And so here we have, hey, Alan, do you mind reading for us, beginning verse 3 here? And now, O Lord my God. This
Sure.
is Solomon's prayer to God. Go ahead.
And now, O Lord, okay. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. But I am a young lad with no experience in leadership. Your servant finds himself in the midst of the people you have chosen, a people too numerous to be numbered or counted. Grant then your servant an understanding mind to judge your people, to distinguish between good and bad, for who can judge this vast people of yours? The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this, and God said to him, because you asked for this, you did not ask for long life, you did not ask for riches, you did not ask for the life of your enemies, but you asked for discernment in dispensing justice. I now do as you have spoken. I grant you a wise and discerning mind. There has never been anyone like you before, nor will anyone like you arise again. And I also grant you what you did not ask for, both riches and glory all your life, the like of which no king has ever had. And I will further grant you long life, if you will walk in my ways and observe my laws and commandments, as did your father David.
Thank you. So when we think of Solomon, what image of Solomon do you have? Probably remember.
Solomon was a serious character, in my opinion. I mean, he did everything, including murder, by the way. And his father's deathbed, David asks him to take care of a couple of things that he hadn't dealt with in his life. 2 people had to be dealt with by murder, and I think a couple of people had to be dealt with by reward. And he had to obey the commandments at the same time. So he has this huge contrast to his life. He's supposedly obeying the commandments, and his first command from his father is to murder someone. Very interesting. But Solomon, in my mind, is a guy who can put together a lot of disparate things. He puts together a lot of disparate things under the sun, which are the transient things, and that's called wisdom. And he puts together maybe things that are above the sun, which are called divine wisdom. So he may, there's no evidence in the books directly that he has divine wisdom. He's not revealing his hand with that, but he's certainly revealing his hand with respect to practical wisdom. So he has lots of practical wisdom. Anyway, and he's an experimentalist too. In the book, he decides he's going to mix madness or folly with wisdom, 2 opposite things, and he's going to pour in a little bit of wine to see when he spins this around what's going to happen. So he's a personal experimentalist with trying lots of different things. And if you, in the reading of this, you get the sense of things that he's tried to see what effect it would have on him. So this is a special kind of a character, Solomon. He's very admirable from lots of perspectives. He certainly is not an aesthete, okay? He has lots of women and even young boys running around in his house, which he talks about in Kohales. He indulges himself in every sensation. He indulges himself in drink. So he's doing the whole human thing to the extreme. Very admirable character in that way. And he doesn't lose track of himself at the same time. And we can get into later how it is that he doesn't lose track of himself while he's doing all of this.
So beautiful. And this is the character of Solomon in Kohelet. And how does it relate to the story of Solomon that we find in the book of Kings? What do we know about Solomon from the book of Kings? We don't get quite as much of the fullness of what David was talking about, all his experimentation, but we know he has many wives. He has many foreign wives. He's very astute. He marries the wives of pharaohs and of other kings to build alliances. There's a story of the Queen of Sheba. And he does dabble in other religions. He's led astray, which the Tanakh is not all complimentary about. But in the end of his life, he's led astray to worship all of the gods that the Torah tells us not to, and that his wives bring into Jerusalem. And by the end of his life, we have the stories that there are temples to the gods of the neighboring nations all throughout the hills and valleys of Jerusalem. So
There have been discussions about the Haggadah that the simple son was supposed to be Solomon. I never understood how that coincides with him having been considered a wise king.
It's why he needed to ask for knowledge. If he really was the simple son, then he knew he needed help.
Would a simpleton know to ask for wisdom? Would he know enough to be able to ask? Is the question.
This one did. This one did.
As David said, even if he is the simple son, I mean, we have this long tradition in Tanakh of the younger son rising up, the weaker, so to speak, younger son rising up and taking power over his older brother or brothers who've been doing what they're doing for ages, trying to grab power, and he just comes and makes it happen. And so, as David was saying, I mean, he's very clever from the beginning. He moves ruthlessly. I mean, David tells him to finish some of the business, which he couldn't, partly because he made an oath, David, not to kill Shimi, and also there was the Yoav was maybe too powerful for David to deal with. But Solomon is able to do this, and he's able to very quickly, right? The whole end of the previous book was about all of his brothers fighting each other for power and not succeeding. But Solomon manages very quickly to take power.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Something pops into my head as I'm hearing the group talk. Maybe Solomon is teaching us that we need to have a central faith and central connection to Judaism and God. We need to also be able to learn from others who are around us and be able to draw wisdom in, not just from our own tradition, but from others' traditions.
Mm-hmm. Well, interesting. And so I think this takes us nicely to a really important time. Why is he called Kohelet? Why is he not called Solomon? And if you look at his other two books, we see that the book of Proverbs, here I might as well bring it up. The book of Proverbs begins with the words, let's see. the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. Very direct. We know the book of Proverbs is of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. And if you go to the book of Song of Songs, same thing. It begins the Song of Songs by Solomon, Shir Hashirim Asher Shlomo. So obviously, the book itself begins. Those two books tell us that it's by Solomon, but the book of Kohelet never mentions the word Solomon. Never. Solomon is not mentioned. Instead, we have this word which comes back again and again, Kohelet. And what does Kohelet actually mean? If you look in your editions, they'll probably say Kohelet means to gather. And maybe it's because he gathered wisdom. And I was thinking about this when you were speaking, Frank, because you say he's gathering wisdom from different traditions. And it's really one of the themes of the whole book is this idea that he's gathered everything that's under the sun. And I like how David brought it in, but it keeps coming back to this idea of what's under the sun and what's in our world. And there's different ways of viewing Kohelet. We're going to get far into this. Some people see him, as David does, as someone who's really tried every human experience and dabbled in every human experience and what's left from it. Others see it from a more, look at it from other angles as a book that's actually about piety, or a book that's about being essentially realizing at the end of his life that it's not about all of those experiences. So it's, again, this is one of the things where scholars disagree. What is the message? And again, there's even a prominent scholar who believe that there's a Buddhist influence, and really what he's saying is that like the Buddha, who is a prince, and ultimately he realizes that that all of that life has nothing to teach one. That really it's all about inner experiences and being in the moment. And that's also one way of looking at the book of Kohelet. It's all about being in the moment. So we go to the beginning of the book of Kohelet. We're going to read the first two verses. Would somebody like to read the first two verses for us? Herb, how about you?
Before you do that, can I ask something?
Sure,
What
go ahead.
Alan read in Kings was God said to him, but do not go astray. But it sounds like at the end, everything he did was astray.
Beautiful. Yeah, he did that very much. There's a sense from the Bible is very critical of Solomon. At the end of his life, he went astray. And, in some ways, we value King David even more than King Solomon, even though King Solomon built a temple. But our tradition has, in some ways, an even greater affection for David. And maybe because Solomon went astray and didn't, at the end of his life, he didn't keep to the ways of David and to the ways of God. And in some ways, that's a good reflection of where this book takes us, which is in some ways the pursuit of wisdom itself. At some point, he says, is futile. If you go too far into pursuing everything, it can lead you through dangerous pathways. And I think it's one of the ways that that this book, in some ways, is seen as a redemption of Solomon and of that end of his life, and of having gone too far off the derech, off the path, as we say. Thanks for bringing that up. Norma, how about you read for us for these first two verses?
The words of Kohelet, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Utter futility, said Kohelet. Utter futility. All is futile.
Okay, thank you. So before we get into the futile and that whole discussion of what that means, I want to stay focused on Kohelet a little bit. And again, it could have said, if it wanted to tell us something about, who Solomon is and something of his character as the author of this book, it could have said the words of Kohelet, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Utter futility, says Solomon. But it keeps calling him Kohelet. The whole book, it keeps calling him Kohelet. Why does it keep calling him Kohelet? This is a word that appears nowhere else in the entire Tanakh, Kohelet. Rashi will tell us that because he's gathering wisdom, that's what it means. But there have been other interesting ideas. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs has a really interesting whole approach, which I really find compelling. And that is, so what is the root of the word Kohelet? I think I'm going to spend some time about this because I think the character of Solomon, of all the wisdom books, this is the one where the character of the author is most important and plays the most central role. And Kohelet is the author, and the fact it doesn't say Solomon, I think, is important. And what does this verb mean? Kohelet. Well, it means to gather. And under one context does it mean to gather. We're going to go and do a little search through the text to see where this verb is usually, and this noun is usually word. So kahal, right? A congregation, right? To congregate. We have the word kahal, a congregation, comes from is the same root as kohelet. And we're going to go do a little bit of a looking. So the 612th mitzvah of the entire Torah is called hakel. So this is almost the very last mitzvah in the entire Torah, right? There's 613, and this is a 612th mitzvah. And it's appears Deuteronomy 31, verse 10, it begins. Herb, do you mind reading for us? And Moses instructed them as follows.
Moses instructed them as follows. Every 7th year, this year set for remission and Feast of Booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God in the place that he will choose, you shall read this teaching aloud in the presence of all Israel. Gather the people, men, women, children, and the strangers in your communities, that they may hear and so learn to revere the Lord your God and to observe faithfully every word of this teaching.
Thank you. So you see the first word of verse 12 is hakel, gather the people. So this was a mitzvah. One of the reasons we had our Torah event during Sukkot is because of this, right? There's a mitzvah on Sukkot to gather the people to learn Torah and to hear the whole Torah, to hear wisdom. So this is one of the places where this is used, gather the people. There's another one, right? If there's the Parsha Vayakel. Vayakel is from the book of Deuteronomy. It's one of the Parshiot of the Torah. So if we go to Torah portion, Vayakel, same root as Kohelet. Moses then, Herb.
Moses then convoked the whole Israelite community and said to them, these are the things that the Lord has commanded you to do.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Vayakel, again, Vayakel. Anybody know at the end of the book of Exodus what he's convoking the people to do? To build a tabernacle, right? To build a tabernacle, to build. And then again, here we have an even more direct link. Okay, Kings 1, chapter 8. Herb, there's a last one, verse 1.
Solomon convoked the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes, and the ancestral chieftains of all the Israelites, before King Solomon in Jerusalem, to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord from the city of David, that is Zion.
Okay, beautiful. So as Yakel, again, so here we have directly Solomon. This is the only time in Tanakh where we have Solomon himself gathering the people. And what is he gathering them to do? To conclude the building of the temple and to gather to bring the ark into the temple. So this, on one hand, this is a direct link to the holiday of Sukkot. And when do we read Kohelet? We read it during Sukkot, right? Because the Hakel mitzvah is during Sukkot, and here he's building the tabernacle. But it's even more, I think, we're going to get into this, one of the chief themes of the book is going to be about, well, what's life about? Is it about building? Is it about creating? Is it about going out into the world and creating work and doing and building, even if it is building temples? Or is it about something else? So his name is Kohelet. Not only did he gather wisdom, but he gathered pretty much everything. As we were saying earlier, he gathered a lot of wives too, right? He had hundreds of wives, which he gathered. So he was someone who gathered all the things of this world and who built. He was a builder. He built a temple, he built a palace, he built a kingdom. He was a gatherer and a builder, someone who was a master in this world, in the things of this world, of what's under the sun, as we were saying earlier. And so we're not going to go ahead. Somebody's about to say something.
May I ask? Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank. May I ask if the as I understand it, those are really nice examples. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that those are intensive verbs in those other places, and here we have what I think is the feminine participle, present participle, kohelet of a simple verb, and it's a feminine. And I've always known it was a feminine, but I didn't know what to make of that. And then I've just read that if you have an occupation or a profession, sometimes it becomes a proper name with and it can be a feminine. I don't know why, but do you have anything on that? I don't have anything more than what I read in Scott's Anchor Bible on that, because it always struck me. Well, I knew it was feminine, but that's about all I knew, and I didn't know why.
Well, I'm just thinking. Well, the nouns of the tend to be feminine. Of kehila, right? A congregation is also feminine.
No, I mean the participle, a gathering or
sure,
whatever.
Sure.
I'm sorry.
But you're right. The other verbs are PL. I can't think of anything. Dover, yeah, interesting. Why isn't Kohel? Why is it Kohelet? Why isn't it Kohel? I'll think about that. Maybe see if I can find anything. But thanks for bringing that up. So, keeping in mind that Solomon is the builder, the gatherer, the constructor, the gatherer of people, as well as the gatherer of wisdom, the gatherer of wives, the gatherer of wealth. And now we get to this is his statement, where we'll keep coming back as this trope, as I said, 38 times throughout the book. Utter futility, says Kohelet, utter futility, all is futile. What do you make of that? What is he saying? That everything is futile.
He's depressed.
He's depressed.
Well, but he's
It's a dark
everything
day.
is futile under the sun. He mentions, by the way, under the sun exactly 28 times in this thing too. So the futility and under the sun are really keys. So everything is futile under the sun. Everything that is transitory is futile. So he's coming from a tradition which believes that only the eternal things are not futile. So anything that's transitory, anything that's happened, work, life, etc., all of that stuff is futile. But he obviously believes and feels that the eternal things are not futile. So I think he's differentiating the eternal things which are not futile, which he doesn't really speak of but reaches, and the futile things which are under the sun. That's my take on that.
And I think it's really he's clearly saying that everything that's under the sun, the things of this world, and that repetition of under the sun really creates a very powerful image. He's saying that those things are futile. But again, what exactly is, there's been so much discussion about how to translate Havel. So if we go here and try and see what different translations of it. So the older, right here, utter futility, this is our new JPS. If we go to the old JPS, vanity of vanities, says Kohelet, vanity of vanities, right? Slightly different shade of meaning. If we go to, this is not sure who Bruce Heitler is, but here he has a different trick. Only vanishing mist, vapor, says Kohelet. Evanescence, a mere appearance. Everything is a vanishing mist. So the way that, let me see, I always have trouble getting back to the right translation. Here we go, perfect. Okay, so the way that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs translates it is everything is a breath. And this is quite a common commentary now, but I remember studying it when I was in rabbinical school, and somebody was trying to show us, well, what is that word in Hebrew, hevel, which they're translating as futile. Everything is futile, everything. Well, we now think it means a breath. It's like when you take it's not any breath, but it's like you're breathing on a window on a winter day and your breath fogs up. It's a shallow breath. This is what people say. It's a shallow breath.
Rabbi?
Yes.
What I feel like I'm hearing is that, the word of God is what's permanent. All of these other things you do to find the word of God are the steps to getting to God, and they're merely transitory.
Beautiful. Everything else, as we're going to read through all of it, everything else is transitory. And what's real? Now, what's real is hard to quite discern, because he says it, but he says it in many different ways. It's at the end, it goes to the word of God, but he also says there are other things which are, these are the places where it's a little bit heretical, where he also seems to suggest that, except for the end, even the word of God, don't pay attention to too many words. Where he places what's really important, what's not transitory, we're going to get to in a minute, because I think we should get there in the introduction. But so if all of life is a shallow breath, what does that mean to you? All of life is a shallow breath. It's a little depressing, and there's a big argument about, is this a depressing book or an uplifting book? And I'd like to see it as an uplifting book, not a depressing book. But if I tell you all of life is a shallow breath, the way Rabbi Sachs sees it is that all of life is transitory and fleeting, but also very precious, right? What is a breath? Breath is our life. Breath is our very life. We're all one breath away from not waking up, right? We stop breathing, we know what happens. We die. And I was reading a book that came out, a little bit of a book that came out recently. There was a bestseller, and it's all about breathing. And it's about how we've lost the art of breathing in the West, and how breathing in ancient traditions and in other places, people breathe better. And there's a lot of science around this that, if your lungs, right, your lungs are there your whole life breathing for you. And there are many things that are modern life which is causing us not to breathe well, which affects so many medical conditions, and which affects also our emotional state and our mental state. And it's why in yoga and other practices there's all this emphasis on breathing. And there's a lot of studies to back all of this up, medical studies. But breath itself, for the ancients, as is for us, was life, right? All the words for soul in Hebrew come from words for breathing. Nishama is so close to nishima, breath, nishama. And ruach, another word for soul in Hebrew, is a breath, or is a wind, is a breath. So there's this idea of breath being connected to life itself. So when Kohelet says everything is futile, he's saying everything is a breath. Everything is so precious, and we're all so short, and so all of life is so precious and can just be lost in an instant. And I think that the preciousness of a breath, because our breathing is precious to us, that's what gives us life, shifts it a little bit, because futile sounds very depressing and negative, as Herb says. But if you say everything is not just futile, but everything is also precious, everything is transient, it's not quite as negative. And again, this word for breath comes up 38 times. He keeps going back and again and saying everything is just this shallow breath, this hevel. And it's his wisdom. He is the wisest king of all time and the wealthiest, one of the wealthiest kings of his era. He's dabbled in everything, but in the end, what he's telling us is everything is transitory, everything is a shallow breath. And I wanted to do one more piece of going back of intertextuality. The word for breath in Hebrew is hevel. Who is hevel in the Torah?
Abel, the murdered,
Abel.
the murdered brother.
The murdered brother, right? Hevel is the murdered brother. We're going to go to that story in Tanakh. Right? This is one of the most fundamental stories of mankind. The first story really after Cain, after Adam and Eve leave the garden. Story of Cain and Abel. So let's look at the first two lines. Nancy, do you mind reading for us?
Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gained a male child with the help of the Lord. Then she bore his brother Abel. Abel became a keeper of sheep, and Cain became a tiller of the soil.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. So we know what happens. Cain becomes jealous of Abel and kills him. So if Abel is a shallow breath, if Abel is Hevel, what is Cain? Who is Cain? Cain. What does it say? Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gained. In the Hebrew is kaniti. Anybody know what kaniti means in Hebrew? Liknot is to buy. I have purchased. Cain's name is I have purchased, is purchasing. And by the way, the verb to purchase, kaniti, only comes up in all of Tanakh very few times. Very few times. It comes up a lot in the book of Ruth. But one of the places where it comes up is in Kohelet, where King Solomon says, I have acquired this and I have acquired that. And if I acquired this and I have acquired that. So in some ways, this story in Genesis is about the difference between, right, what's fleeting and precious, what's valuable, and then this whole, and what that spirit of acquiring, that spirit of trying to accumulate, that spirit of, and we see that in the beginning of the Tanakh, we've just been reading about this, right? Right, all the stories of Babel and of the humanity there, it's all about that selfishness, it's all about acquiring, and what's the opposite of acquiring? It's spirit, it's the mind, it's what's eternal. So it has deeper tropes in Tanakh, right? To the ancients, you would have heard the words of Hevel. You are thinking straight away to Hevel in the Torah because you know those stories, right? These are your stories. So there's a strong connection there, and we're setting up this theme of acquiring, of accumulating, of gathering, of purchasing. And on one hand, on the other hand, but what is really precious when we meet with the fleetingness of life, how fleeting life is, the shallow breath. And I want to take us to one more place before we conclude. And this is just to give us a little bit of a window into what's going to come. So it's true. The two expressions that come up the most are under the sun and hevel, everything is futile. But there's one more word which comes up many times in Kohelet, and which you find almost nowhere else. And again, a lot of this is coming from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. And that is the word simcha. What does simcha mean?
Joy.
Joy or happiness, right? Simcha means joy. How many times does the word simcha come up in the book of Genesis? Just once. How many times does the word simcha come up in the book of Exodus? Just once. How many times does the word simcha come up in the book of Leviticus? Just once. How many times does the word simcha appear in the book of Numbers? Just once. How many times did it appear in the book of Deuteronomy? A good amount of times, 8 times. How many times does the word happiness come up in the book of Kohelet? Comes up 14 times. Comes up more times, and maybe it's even 16. Is it 14, 16? I can't remember now. It comes up more in the verb in Ecclesiastes, and it comes up in the whole of the Torah, in the 5 books. because this book is not only about a depressing book about how dark all of life is and don't try and do anything. It's a book about simcha. Where do you find your happiness?
Oh.
What is happiness about? Go ahead, Herb, you're about to say something. So anyway, so what is happiness about? Now, as I often talk about this, right? The Eskimos have many words for snow, and we Jews have a lot of words for happiness, right? We Jews have a lot of words for happiness. Now, what is another word for happiness? From Ashrei, it's Osher, right? Happy are the people whose God is Adonai, right? Happy. But the difference between Osher and Simcha, right? When we say we're going to a Simcha, what are we saying?
Going to a happy event.
We're going to a happy event. Now, the happiness of a happy event is not the happiness of, the joy of a fulfillment through a whole life. It's a temporary happiness, right? It's you go to a wedding or you go to a simcha and you enjoy the event that happened. And so the joy of simcha is one of Kohelet's answers. The joy of being in the moment, right? When you go to a simcha, often, even if you're having a horrible day, or even if you're going through struggle, or your nation is going through a struggle, it gets erased, right? The joy of a wedding overtakes everything, and you're dancing and doing the hora and having a good time. And so, one of the answers of Kohelet to what is life about, if it's so fleeting, if it's a whole shallow breath, is finding joy in the here and now. This is the Buddhist side also to Kohelet, or just to be here and now, be in the moment, just find the joy right now in the moment. If all of life is fleeting, if all of life is transitory, not just for him, but for all of us, right? And this holiday is connected, this book is connected to Sukkah, right? If all of life is a Sukkah, right? Forget the building of the temple. The life is not like a temple. Life is more like a Sukkah than a temple. You've got your little shoddy building around you. The body is like is more like a sukkah, starts to fall apart. So what do we do if everything you try and build in life is so fleeting? If all of your wealth is fleeting, if all of even your relationships are fleeting, what do you do? And part of that answer, and the answer of Judaism, connecting to Kohelet, is finding just the joy of being in the moment, just finding that simcha, the simcha of being with other people, the simcha of finding a little moment of joy here in your daily life with your loved ones, or just doing the little things you love, and just being in the present, because essentially everything else we're doing is transitory. Even the most lofty of our preoccupations, gathering wisdom and acquiring knowledge, that's also nothing. That also in the end is futile. So in the end, if everything is illusionary, if everything is transitory, where do we find meaning? Where do we find purpose in life? One of his answers is going to be in simcha. Part of it is going to be in just finding that little bit of happiness.
Our moment of zen.
Go ahead, Phil.
Our moment of zen.
A moment of zen.
Rabbi, this almost talks about how we as humans have a tendency just to think about, well, it's going to get better, it's going to get better, it's going to get better. And so when it is better and we're living in it, we just ignore it because we're trying to reach for something else.
Exactly.
Well,
we're always trying to reach. We're always trying. We're like him. We're always vayaket. We're always gathering. We're always trying to gather more and more and more, right? And most of us don't have the opportunities that Kohelet had to gather, right? We can gather a little bit of wealth. We can gather a little bit of spouses. We can gather a little bit of possessions. But here is someone who gathered everything, a lot of spouses, a lot of wealth, a lot of experiences. And so we're always still trying to gather, so we can't come to it. But he's telling you, I've gathered it all. And let me tell you what I've learned from trying to gather. It's not about gathering, because everything is so shallow. Even the stuff that you think are so important, gold and silver, is all the things that we try and gather, in the end, it's all a shallow breath, because you can't take it with you wherever you go next. You can't take any of that.
That is very Buddhist.
Yeah.
That
Well-
is very Buddhist, to live in the moment.
Well, in my reading of this, the Solomon comes at the end in a way of saying, I am aware that I am aware. And that's really the answer to the whole thing. And being aware, it's the same thing the rabbi is talking about, living in the moment. The moment actually is where eternity touches time. And this is not just my view of this. Actually, if you read Aristotle's Physics, he's trying to define the now of time, and he can't define it at all. And in fact, a lot of people think that the now of time, the space between the past and the future, which is the now of time, is really where the action is. That's where the eternal things are felt and experienced. That's what I think that Solomon is telling us throughout the whole book.
And maybe what's.
I don't know if that's a Buddhist view. I'm not.
It's
Very
what-
Buddhist, right?
It's
But it is Buddhist, but
Buddhist
maybe
and
it's
other
also,
traditions. Go ahead.
maybe it's also just universal.
Sure,
Maybe Buddhism came to the same universal idea that is found in Kohelet and some other places.
Exactly. It's a universal
matter where it
idea that
came.
in our modern tradition has a lot of, now we see it as a Buddhist idea, but here's Kohelet talking about it. And maybe that's what's above the sun. What's underneath the sun is everything that you're trying to gather and trying to build, the materiality and all of that. But what we can access, even though we're beneath the sun, what we can access is the eternal through being in the moment, through joy, right? Joy is God's commandment to us. Rejoice in the holiday, rejoice. So joy is a divine gift from God to us. And there's an opportunity to find joy in every moment, unconnected to our circumstances of life. That's what simcha is about. It's joy that's unconnected to the circumstances of our life that we can find nonetheless. And that's the biggest, what bigger key to fulfillment and the happiness in life is there, but to find that bliss, to find joy, to find meaning, despite the circumstances of life. Because the circumstances of life, despite all of the power that we may have in this world, and none of us will have the power that Kohelet had in his time, we still are going to die one day. At least that's the baseline. We may have better healthcare than Kohelet, but we are still all going to die. So what is it all about? Thank you all for joining. This is just an introduction to the book. And next week, we'll begin to delve more into it and to reading and analyzing the first chapter.
Thank you very
Very good.
much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Great pleasure.
Thank you, Rabbi. This is very good.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
You. Have a good week, everybody.
Thank you,
You too.
everyone.
See everybody.
Bye-bye.